The concept of the soul is an attribute that is deeply rooted in all religious scriptures, including Islam. That is, human beings have a body that is finite and an immaterial attribute known as the soul that is sustained even after death. The Islamic perspective describes this inner self of an individual being composed of four parts: the heart, known as the qalb, the spirit, known as the ruh, the self or the ego, known as the nafs, and the mind, known as the aql. To be specific, the ruh is the life force that sustains being alive, and the nafs is understood as the self, the identity, and the core of human existence, which includes consciousness and awareness. Each part reflects a different aspect of the psyche, although they interact with each other in a way that overlaps. These distinctions and definitions of the inner self is extremely important to define in what it means to be a complete human, as without it, the lines between what is a person and what is not becomes obscure and confusing. In such a way, it is also extremely vital to understand ourselves and our inner world before we can understand the true matters of reality. And that is why an empirical look at the inner self, or the loosely used word soul, becomes necessary, as how can we start to believe in Allah if we're not sure about our own selves? With the development of the physical sciences, the notion of the soul became a term that was interchangeably used in different contexts. In the 17th century, the famous philosopher René Descartes has highlighted the concept of the soul with the idea of dualism, which explains the interactive nature of the soul and the body. His famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," fundamentally gave rise to the field of neuroscience, in which we are able to understand the dualistic nature of the mind and body, such as the soul is equated with the mind or the individual personality, and in such a way the word began to mean different things to different people. Somewhere along the progress of secular knowledge, the notion of a soul, that is an immaterial element that defines the essence of life itself, has taken a back seat to give importance to physiology and psychology of the human brain. However, it seems that with deeper intuitions and with some interesting experiments, it seems something does seem to exist beyond the material world and our physical bodies. It is said the human brain is where consciousness exists. In the materialist position, conscious awareness can be explained purely from a physiological behavioral cognitive constructivist sense. Even though this particular assertion of materialism is correct, the issue with this kind of premise arises when we start to equate human beings, namely human consciousness, with computers and machines. For example, the famous Alan Turing experiment demonstrates computers were able to have an interactive conversations with people, while the people on the other side believed that they were speaking to a person. The problem with such experiments is that even though computers can imitate human behaviors and are capable, based on their algorithms, to pick up and apply new information autonomously, machines ultimately do not feel, comprehend, understand, or have subjective real experience in a meaningful way. Computers demonstrate information based on a purely syntactic method that are based on arrangements in its programming, whereas human minds can go beyond such scope towards developing semantic information that focuses on understanding things with real, meaningful insight. David Chalmers, a prominent contemporary philosopher, says the notion of consciousness has a hard problem. The hard problem of consciousness is the inability to explain subjective consciousness, or what something feels like. For example, the color red. The experience cannot be understood in terms of reading or acquiring information about it without actually subjectively experiencing the color red. Though it is totally plausible that machines can have sophisticated systems in which it can depict self-awareness in terms of scanning and assessing, whereby it may imitate human cognitive functions. We know that machines do not have abilities of free will, such as preferences as likes and dislikes, or complex emotions. For example, computers cannot ever develop feelings of guilt or remorse for any of its actions. It can only pretend to be if we program it. So unlike the materialist world that fundamentally looks into the superiority of human experience in terms of higher levels of consciousness, it does not look into the aspect of why human beings are able to feel things in such a deep and meaningful way, and why most of us have a conscience of what is right and wrong inherently hardwired in us. This is why Allah says, Allah has brought you forth from your mother's wombs when you knew nothing, and He made you ears, eyes, and hearts, so that you may be grateful. Surah Nahl, verse 78. So Allah is saying that He installed within us the ability to hear, to see, and have the strongest heart full of passion. We were designed this way so that we reach the final goal of reaching gratitude, because He allows us to live a life of not just passively taking in information, but also allowed us to truly understand and evaluate things with meaningful insight, to really enjoy and appreciate our world. So keeping in mind that Allah has placed some faculties in us that make us understand things with meaning, we also understand that we're able to experience matter in a uniquely singular way. It is confirmed in biology that on average, every 8 years, the human body goes through a complete cellular level change. Meaning the body that we had roughly 8 years ago is not the same body we have now. But despite this massive cellular level change, we still consider ourselves the same person we did 8 years ago. Maybe we are wiser and more experienced, but we know we are still the same person in a relatable way. This singular and subjective experience is intuitive of what we consider in the personal identity theory as the self, or me, inside ourselves. It is important to realize that although we are all passive spectators of what we see and hear from our world within our own minds, but there is something that is within us that is taking in information, something that has the ability to judge, to comprehend and imagine, and more importantly, something that has intent and will. This something, when we try to dissect and find within our hearts and brain, we intuitively feel it in the brain. In neuroscience, when we observe the thoughts of a person, we can see specific parts of the brain fired up when the person engages in thinking or any type of mindful activities. The question here is, what is it that initiates the first spark of the neuron to think or do anything at all? It is nothing other than the soul, or the inner self within us, the ghost in the machine. This is as close as we think we have gotten in regards to the soul. Allah says, "And they ask you about the ruh. The ruh is something from the command of my Lord, and you are not given from the knowledge of it, but a little." Surah Al-Isra, verse 85. So Allah is saying the ruh, or the spirit, is a command of Allah, and that our knowledge of it is very limited. When we are inside our mother's wombs, it is said at some point the ruh is breathed into our developing fetal bodies. Even though our knowledge of the soul is very limited and we cannot study the soul in a traditional sense, it seems we can detect it. Some interesting experiments seem to display the soul in some concrete sense. One of the first experiments was with the 21 grams experiment. In 1901, Duncan McDonnell, a physician from Harvard Hill, Massachusetts, who wished to scientifically determine if a soul had weight, identified 6 patients in a nursing home whose death were imminent. When the patients looked like they were close to death, their entire bed was placed on an industrial-sized scale. One of the patients lost weight, but then put the weight back on. The 2 of the other patients registered a loss of weight at death, but a few minutes later lost even more weight. One of the patients lost 3/4 of an ounce, 21.3 grams in weight, coinciding with the time of death. Although the experiment had many problematic aspects and was conducted on a very small sample, it did seem to display that after a person's death, there is a loss of weight, thus indicating that something is not present in the body anymore. More recently, Dr. Sam Parnia, a researcher at NYU's Langone Medical Center and expert in patient resuscitation, have conducted a study of patients who have experienced near-death experiences. The results of his research are both fascinating and chilling.
At any rate, so this particular study is the largest study ever carried out in the world. It was done at 15 medical centers across the US and in Europe. And we studied more than 2,000 people who'd gone through this cardiac arrest or process of death. And we did not expect people to have any consciousness or awareness. But intriguingly, up to 40% of people came back and had a perception of being aware of what was happening to them, even though they had technically gone beyond the threshold of death.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot to it. I should also add that among that group, 10% had a very deep, profound mystical experience that was very true to them. But interestingly, 2% actually had full awareness, could describe all the events that were going on that were validated.
Dr. Parnia goes on to say that it sounds like maybe consciousness is able to continue, and by that we don't mean that they are awake, but that entity that means us, the self, the mind, seems to continue and does not become annihilated when the process of death takes place. The most interesting part of his interview was 2% of the patients revived was validated to know specific details of events which they could not have known, such as what someone was wearing or doing, or even repeating back statements of what was being said when they were fully unconscious and being resuscitated by doctors. It seems now, with more research done in various fields like quantum mechanics and neuroscience, it is becoming clear that consciousness is fundamental. The position completely tears down any prospect of materialism and suggests that consciousness is the only real thing that is sustainable. The result not only defies classical intuition, but suggests that part of the mind, the soul, is immortal and exists outside of space and time.
That is the deep mystery, is the awareness of existence. And what I would submit is that we're conscious in spite of our brain. And so, in fact, the big surprise and kind of the practical lesson for human beings is that when your physical brain and body die, your conscious awareness actually expands tremendously.
These values are completely in line with Islamic scriptures, as Allah says, "Every soul shall taste death." Surah Al-Imran, verse 185. So, death will only be a taste and is only one time of our physical body, and through this transition, the ruh will be sustained to realize the grand truth of its existence. To Allah we belong, and to Him is our return. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 156. Recalling that the ruh is a command of Allah, when God associated the spirit with His command, and sometimes His loftiness, God the Most High is too lofty to bring a body into association with Himself because of their loneliness and their ability to change and the rapidity of their cessation and corruption. Since the soul is a command from the Creator, the Most High, it is in the body like a stranger, and its direction towards its source and its place of return. Imam Al-Ghazali. To put everything into perspective, we can imagine our ruh is like the heart with wings. The heart wants to fly towards the absolute light of Allah, but it is shackled down by the nafs that are associated with the bodily desires, ignorance, and ego infiltrated in us from the worldly illusions. In order to break free and truly reach the ultimate source of light and pristine peace, we must learn to train our hearts and minds to always focus on the remembrance of Allah, the Most High, the Most Supreme. If we fail to do so, our hearts begin to turn hard from the darkness as it becomes devoid of the remembrance of Allah.